Hello, welcome to a new oXygen XML webinar. My name is George Bina, and I will be your host today. I invited my colleague Alex to talk about unit testing for XSLT. This is our first webinar in 2017, and we plan to have more webinars. 2 are already scheduled, covering multimedia support in oXygen and a technical writer's perspective on using data. Before we start, here is some useful information. The usual question that we receive is whether the webinar will be recorded or not, and the answer is yes. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel called oXygen XML, of course, and it will be made available also from the event page. So the page that you use to register for this webinar. You can ask questions at any time during the webinar using either the questions panel in the webinar interface, or you can also ask them via Twitter if you mark those questions with either the oXygen XML hashtag, or if you address them to the oXygen XML to our account at oXygen using @oXygen XML. At the end of the presentation, we will have a dedicated question and answer section where we will go through the questions that you asked during the webinar, and of course you can ask also additional questions at that time. So thank you for joining us, and without further ado, I will give control to Alex to show you unit testing support in oXygen using XSpec. Hi, Alex.
Hello, George. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all for attending this webinar. So in the next minutes, we'll see what a unit test is and how it can help you in XSLT development. So today's agenda, like I said, we'll present what a unit test is, how to use it in XSLT development. Afterwards, we'll talk a bit about the XSpec framework, which is a unit testing framework for XSLT. And it's the one that we've chosen to integrate into oXygen. We'll see how to create unit tests in oXygen. And last but not least, we'll talk about why documenting your style sheets is a good thing and how oXygen can help you in that regard. So let's begin. So why unit testing? You've probably heard that these words many times. My code is rock solid. I do not need tests. It's just a waste of time. Well, that's not true at all. Unit testing is an essential part in XSLT development process, and on the long run, it increases the speed of development. And why am I saying that? Well, because the less tests you write, the less robust your code becomes, which means that whenever you make changes in it, there are chances that something will break, and things will break. And more things, because things will break, you'll have more things to fix, which will result in you having less time. And because you have less time, you'll write less tests. So it's kind of like a domino effect. You keep going from bad to worse. And this is where it all begins, at the moment when you decided to write less tests. So now, hopefully, I managed to convince you that more unit tests means less stress, and believe me, I've learned that the hard way. I just want to point out what characterizes a unit test? Well, first of all, a unit test, it verifies the behavior of a small part of the application. And because of that, it is very easy to implement. And when it fails, you'll know exactly where the fault is, because it only tests that small part from your application. And if you write many such tests, then your entire application will be covered. Now, for example, if I write a test in which I take my entire XSLT framework and I apply it on an input, and then the resulting HTML file, let's say, I take this output file and I make some assertion on it. That's not a unit test. That's more like an integration test. And when that test will fail, I won't know for sure which is the culprit. I'll have to debug, and it might take some time for me to find the problem. Integration tests are useful. They help you to test the big picture, but don't forget the unit tests. Now, the test-driven development is a software development process that can also be applied to XSLT. And in it, you begin by describing a behavior, which means writing a test. And after that, you test if your code has this particular behavior. And if it doesn't, only at this point will you begin developing the code until it does, which means the test passes. And if you develop your style sheets using this procedure, on the long run, you'll have a lot of regression tests, all these unit tests that you've created. And you can rest assured that new functionality will not break the existing one. And you can also refactor your code without fear, because those little unit tests will be there to let you know where you're breaking something. Now, this test-driven development works very well for XSLT because you can focus on the expected behavior. And what does that mean for XSLT? Well, for example, when processing a short description element, it should create a P element. Or the scenarios can be a little more complex, like if you're processing an FN element and this has a label attribute, then it should create a P element with a sub child that holds the content of that attribute. So this brings us to the XSpec framework, which is a unit test and behavior-driven development framework for XSLT and xQuery. It consists in a syntax for defining behaviors, plus the mechanisms, the tools to test your code against these descriptions. It is an open source project available on GitHub. It is a robust one. A new version was just released, so the project is live, things are moving. And that's why we decided, in order to help XSLT developers that work in oXygen, in order to help them apply these test-driven development techniques, to integrate the XSpec framework into oXygen. So now you can start creating these unit tests right away. Now I think now it's time for the demo part. A short overview of what we'll see. So we'll see how oXygen supports you in creating and working on XSpec scenarios. We'll also see an XSpec wizard for creating these files, and how to run the XSpec files once you've created them. So I'll switch to oXygen. So my samples files for tonight, I have some source file that contains a number of books and a style sheet that has a number of templates and functions that process these books in specific ways. Now let's create an XSpec, well, actually more XSpec scenarios for different templates and functions from my file. Now I do know that I said that in test-driven development you start by writing the tests, but this is also a real situation. Many of you already have a lot of style sheets, and maybe we'll decide to write unit tests after this webinar, hopefully. So I'll start with an existing XSL just to show you how you can do things. So in oXygen project view, I'll present a contextual menu on the style sheet, and from the new submenu, I'll select the XSLT unit test action. We can change the name if we like. Then we'll customize it. So now the wizard presents all the components from my style sheet that can be tested. Either match templates or named templates or functions. And I can select which one I want to create tests for. I'll select a few, and this checkbox here on the top of the dialog will help you if your style sheet requires specific Saxon settings, or it depends on some extension functions. We will automatically detect these from the transformation scenario associated with the XSL, and will configure automatically the XSpec transformation. But in my case, it doesn't really matter how I leave this checkbox, because I don't have such a requirement. So let's create our first XSpec file. So the XSpec file is just an XML file. It has, like I said, some elements for describing the scenarios. I've created 3 scenarios for the components that I've selected in the wizard. I can run this test right away by pressing the Apply Transformation Scenario button here. The transformation is running, and this is the report. It's not much in it yet because none of my tests are implemented. But as we work on the scenarios, we'll begin seeing more information in this report. So let's return to oXygen, and let's focus on our first scenario. So this is the scenario that tests a function named total. The first thing we should do is remove this pending attribute. That's how we tell to the XSpec tools not to execute a scenario, because it's not finished yet. I'm working on it, or I'll leave it for later. So we'll remove this attribute. Now, the call element calls my function, the ftotal function. And my function has a parameter named books, and the wizard automatically detected that, so it added for me an param element. And to give the value for this parameter, I will just give it here in line. I'll copy a few books from my source file, like this. So that's one way to give values and context. The other way, if we go on the param element and we evoke content completion, you see oXygen will help you through content completion to work on an XSpec file. Another way to give context is by using the href attribute and the select attribute. The href will load the file and the select will just pick a small part from that file. But for my demonstration, I'll prefer the inline method because at a glance we can see what the function process and what I expect it to give me in the output. Now, these expect elements are the assertions of my scenarios. So for this assertion is about the total price of the given books. And if we sum up the prices, it adds to 43. I can either give the value here in the select, or again I can put it here in line. So let's see how my function works if it produces the expected result, if it has this behavior. Again, I will run the transformation from the toolbar. And now we're seeing something. We see that this scenario was executed. It has failed, this red icon at the beginning. And we also see that the expected result was 43, but the actual result was 18. So my function doesn't have the desired behavior. So it's time to go in the XSLT and see what's wrong with it. We will return to oXygen, select the XSL, search for my function. So this is just an indirection for the sum function, and if we look here, we'll notice that from the received sequence of books, it only takes the first one. So I've probably tested something and forgot this index here. So we'll remove it, save the XSL, return to the XSpec file, and run the transformation again. And this time, the scenario has passed. So the function has the desired behavior. Let's move to our second scenario. So this second scenario is about book headings. Let's not forget to remove the pending attribute. Please notice that it uses the same call element, but this time it invokes a template, not a function, as we did in the first scenario. This is the name of the template. It has one parameter named book, and it is a book, as you've probably guessed. So I'll just copy one of these books from here, and just as before, I'll give it in line here. So if my template is invoked with this particular book, then the expected behavior for the header format is, I'll copy it from a different file just to speed things up. I don't want to type it all. So the expected behavior is a div element with an h1 HTML element that presents the title, and in another div element will present the date and the author. So this is the what I expect my template to give me. Now, to execute the XSpec again, I could run the transformation scenario as I did before, but this type of going back and forth between oXygen and the browser will start becoming annoying at some point. So what I'll do instead is I'll click this action on the toolbar, XSpec run. This view on the bottom will appear. The XSpec scenarios are executed, and the same results are presented. The same results that you've seen in the browser are now presented embedded inside oXygen. So this is my current scenario that I'm working on, the book headings, and this is the assertion that failed. If I click show here, that assertion will be selected in the editor. To see why it failed, I can expand it and have a look. Now, the expected result and the actual result, the differences between them are rendered using highlights. And if your structure is complex enough, it can become difficult to notice at a glance what the differences are, the actual differences. In this case, please note that I expected an H1 element here, but I actually got an H2 element. So to help you understand the differences faster, this view has this diff button link, and if you click it, it will launch oXygen diff files application, and in it, at a glance, I can see that, oh look, I've obtained an H2 element, but the expected snapshot says that an H1 should be generated. And the second difference is that the author has a written word that it shouldn't be there. So just a glance is enough. So let's return to oXygen now, and let's go to the XSLT and see what's wrong with the template. So this is the print book title template, and so here is the first problem. An H1 element should be generated. Now, for example, if I want to run my scenario again, I could go to the XSpec file, but again, I have this going back and forth between the XSLT and the XSpec file. And chances are I won't be able to fix the tests from the first try. So at some point this going back and forth will become annoying. So what I can do in this expect test results view is, without leaving the XSLT, I can click run on this particular scenario, and only this scenario, the scenario that I'm working on, is executed. You see that these other two scenarios have this gray icon and it says skipped here. So this is again something that you'll do a lot while working on a specific scenario. You'll make changes and run that scenario again and again until the scenario passes. So let's see what changed. Well, let's use oXygen diff tool. And we see that the H1 is as expected, but this written particle wasn't solved yet. Let's return to the XSLT, and here it is. I'll delete it. We'll just leave the by and the author. We'll run the scenario again from the view. And finally, my template has the desired behavior. Now let's go to the scenario. And one more thing that I want to tell you before moving to the next scenario is that inside the scenario you can have multiple assertion, multiple accept elements. So for example, I can put another one here, another expect element with a label that tests the date format. And what I want to test now is that my date is in a span element and it has this particular format. So just this little part here. So I'll copy this, and this is the expected content. But I also have to use the test attribute on the expect element and retain from the output just this span element that I'm interested in. So my template will generate this div element, and with an expat expression I'll make sure I test just this particular span descendant. Let's make a bad assertion so that we see that this test actually functions. So let's run the test again, and yeah, right, so the expected result is, this time is a bad one. I put it this way. It should be 10, like I'm obtaining. And I can run the test again. And now both of my assertions are met. Time to focus on our last scenario. So this time we're testing a match template. So for this, we need to give it a context. And we do that by using the context element from XSpec. And with the mode attribute, I can impose a specific mode. And the context for this template is a books element that contains a few books. I'll copy the same books from above And what I want to assert is how my outline will look like. And an unordered, more specifically the fact that an unordered list is used in the outline. So I should obtain an UL element. The first list item contains the title of the first book, and the second list item contains the title of the second book. Let's run the scenario. It fails. We can use this quick diff and see that actually my template produced an ordered list instead of an unordered list. Again, we'll go in the XSLT, identify the template using the outline, and we see the culprit just at a glance. We fix the problem. We go to the expect text results view and click run again to run the scenario. And our last scenario is successful. Now, let's see that we didn't break anything while solving each scenario. Let's see the big picture if all the scenarios run successfully. So for this, we can either use this view or we can apply the transformation scenario. Oops. And as you notice, I forgot to remove the pending attribute from my scenario. So it was skipped when I ran all the scenarios. These things happen in a live demo, so be gentle. So let's run them again. And all my unit tests are successful, which is great. Right. So this, so you've seen how an XSpec scenario looks like, how to create them, how to execute them in oXygen. And you've also seen this XSpec helper view. It is not present by default inside oXygen. It is, but it is bundled as an add-on. So if you want to give it a try, all you have to do is copy this URL and use our add-on install mechanism to add it inside oXygen. What does that mean is you'll have to go to help, install new add-ons, just paste that URL here and just follow the installation procedure. Just select the framework and the plugin and just click next and install. And after that you'll also have this button on the toolbar, this XSpec run button. Right, so this plugin, it's an open source project on GitHub. Right now it's on my my personal account, but I intend to move it to the public XSpec GitHub account. So if anyone sees some things that could be done better, has some ideas for improvements, you'll be able to add issues there and even work on the code. And what's great is that this view is customizable just through XSLT, HTML, and JavaScript. So it will be easy enough to change things. You just work on XSLT that generates the HTML. Maybe the HTML will be a bit different. That HTML will be rendered inside this view, and for the interaction part with oXygen, you can use JavaScript through a special bridge that we have in place. So I hope you've seen why unit tests are useful. Maybe you've decided to start using them. That would be great. Please know that once you've created these unit tests, you can also integrate them in a continuous integration server like Jenkins, for example. XSpec can give you an JUnit format that is automatically interpreted by Jenkins, so it will be quite easy to run these XSpec files in a continuous integration system. The next topic of discussion on today's agenda is the XSLT documentation. Now, an XSLT may be written once, but is read many times. For example, when you debug your code, when you add additional functionality, when refactoring, and even when others try to understand or use your style sheets. Let's look at this particular function. So it has a name, total, but a total of what? I don't know. And I see that it has a books parameter, but should this be one books element or a sequence of multiple book elements? To answer these questions, I have to go inside the function code, understand it, and that might mean a waste of time. I would rather understand what this function does and what I should give as its parameters, just from a glance. And I know that the name of the function and the parameter are quite badly chosen. I did it on purpose. But you get the idea why documenting your style sheets is a good practice. So how oXygen helps you? Let's have a look at that, how oXygen helps you document your style sheets. So let's go to the XSL, to this particular function, ftotal. Now what I can do is, if I invoke the contextual menu, I have an action here that says add component documentation. And if I select it, a documentation block will be added. And this is a format, an XML format that we've created. It's possible to do this because the children of the style sheet element can be any element from a specific namespace. And the style sheet execution will just ignore these. And I can say here that this function calculates the total price of the books, and I can also give some details about this books parameter, and I can say it's a sequence of book elements, and I can even add a return element. oXygen's content completion will help you with that, and say it says the total price or something. And if you don't want to, you don't need to use our XML format. We also support HTML. So, for example, you can just put a div file if you want to add the documentation for our name template. Let's copy the namespace like I've told you. It's mandatory, the HTML namespace, so we can say, so this is an HTML div element, and in it I can say documentation, maybe put a bold element in HTML format, like so. Once I've added these documentation blocks in my style sheet, I can use the generate documentation action on the toolbar. In the presented dialog, I can select which components I want to include in my documentation, what details about each component. But for now, we'll go with the defaults, but feel free to explore them. So we'll just hit generate. And here is the documentation for my style sheet in an HTML format. Now, this is the total function. You see the documentation block written in the XML format was transformed into HTML, but for this name template, we also see the documentation block that was written in HTML. And actually, this documentation system is driven by XSLT. We generate the documentation in an intermediate XML format on which we apply XSLT, and this means that if you have a different language with which you document your style sheets, you can very easily extend this feature to also process that documentation format. But this documentation presents more than just that documentation block. For each, so on the left you have a table of contents. You see your templates, your functions. You can group them by locations, etc. For each component, I can see what parameters it has, what references it has. For example, this template uses the format date function, and the links work. So if I click on the format date, I'll go to the definition of the format date function, and in it I also see that it is used by my named template. So I hope I've convinced you to also document your style sheet, as it is a good practice. Thank you for your attention. I hope you'll start using unit tests, document your style sheet if you are not doing that already. If you do, then if you already do, then know that oXygen will help you a lot in this regard. If you have any questions, any suggestions for improvements, you can ask them now. And I also think George wants to show you a few XSpec scenarios that he created for some XSLT based author actions. We are changing a bit the pace. George?
Okay, so we have a few more minutes till the hour. So let me see if I can change and make myself presenter somehow. Yeah, so I wanted to show you, I remember that I worked at some point on adding a framework for strategic markup language in oXygen. And part of that was to define actions, custom actions in oXygen using XSLT scripts. So basically, in this framework for strategic markup language is available on GitHub under oXygen XML strat.ml. And if we move to oXygen and look into the preferences under document type association, for instance, strat.ml, let's see here. You can see, for instance, that the add description action is actually invokes an XSLT operation. So this is a custom action in the author view, and the behavior of that action is controlled by this add description.xsl script. Right, so that means let me see if we can open and create a strategic plan, for instance. And here we have these actions that allow to add a description, for instance, right? And that will add this description element. So if we delete this and we go and add description, you see it adds this description element. This action is controlled by an XSLT script, as you've seen earlier, and I used XSpec to basically test that this action will generate the expected result. For instance, if we have already a description element and we invoke the action, it will keep the content and will just place this caret marker, which is then replaced by oXygen with the caret position. So basically, if we already have a description, it will just place the caret within the existing description, for example. Or here, for instance, it will add the description and so on and so on. So that's a real use for XSpec, and of course I can try it out to run the tests. See, it tests quite a lot of situations for this custom action. It's a real use of XSLT for driving the author actions, the visual editing actions, and then using XSpec to test this. And it's available, as I said, on GitHub. So under scripts, tests, you see there are a number of XSpec tests here. Okay, let's move maybe to the questions. So people were intrigued with what you presented, Alex, that integrated view that kind of makes XProc a lot more interactive, a lot more present inside oXygen.
That's a good thing, yes.
And so we had a number of questions. Where is that button come from? Because people do not have that. And Alex already showed that this is a plugin that he developed for oXygen. So again, on GitHub, Alex Gitiano, this is your ID. Okay. And you can see here the oXygen XML editor XSpec support. And actually this, I think this is also an interesting example of what you can do with plugins in oXygen, right? It's an interesting example of a plugin in case you are interested to develop a similar functionality or something like that. So questions were, does this plugin work with the previous versions of oXygen like 18.0? I'm not sure if you tested with that, but
yes, so I expect it to work with 18.1, 18.0. I've not sure about earlier versions. We add APIs with each version, so I haven't tested it. If it doesn't work, then it is my belief that with a bit of work, it might be made compatible. But for now, we focused on the latest version of oXygen 18.1.
Okay, so there were questions also how to get that magic URL that you used, you showed to install the plugin. So I pasted that in the chat window. You can find it also here in the README of this project, right? So right here. And I guess it will be available together with the recording. We will make available also the slides on the event page. So under the oXygen events, this will move to the past events section. So here you will have the recording and the slides that Alex used. So you will be able to find that also there. I posted that also on Twitter, so there are a lot of places you can get that from. So okay, can you comment on XQuery support in XSpec in general or in oXygen XSpec integration in particular?
Right, so we've focused on XSLT unit testing, at least for now. XSpec can also test XQuery, that's true. So inside oXygen, if you write the XSpec file, you have the content completion support. You can write the scenarios that will test an XQuery file, not an XSLT one. Is just an attribute on the root element of the XSpec file. What you don't have is we don't have a built-in transformation scenario, but it's just a configuration. You can create it. You can create it yourself. There's no wizard for creating the scenarios. So yeah, so we focus more on the XSLT unit tests. But if there is interest, if we see that people are also interested in writing unit tests for XQuery by using XSpec, then we are willing to invest in this direction as well.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment on using this with 18.0. Please know that minor version upgrades are included in the major version. So if you have version 18, that means you already have access to 18.1, and you can use them also side by side, both 18.0 and 18.1. And once you're happy with the 18.1, then you can just delete the previous version, for instance. More questions. Is it easy to ignore certain data, for example, attributes when testing? In case, for instance, when you use generate ID function to provide some values, then it's more difficult probably to assert a code fragment. So there are a few options here. One thing is that you can have multiple asserts, for instance, and you can test relevant parts. You know, test directly that you have that specific element that you expect, or some specific value. Another thing is that you may pass the expected result maybe through some template that will remove those generated parts, and then you can assert a specific fragment, which is, you know, the cleaned up fragment after you process that through such a template that will may remove the attributes that contains generated IDs, for instance. Can I use a collection of multiple files as a context of a scenario?
Well, the XSpec vocabulary also supports imports, so you can create, let's say, a master XSpec file that imports all others and just run the transformation scenario on that. Or inside oXygen's project view, you can apply that transformation scenario on the ancestor directory that contains all those XSpec files, and they will all be executed.
And you mentioned that you want to maybe improve the plugin.
Right, and that's an interesting idea for extending this plugin. This plugin could contribute an action in the project to execute multiple XSpec file, and then it will be able to present them in a grouped manner. Just maybe in this view, you'll be able to see, show me just the test that failed, and so that's something that we should pursue, either us or the XSLT community, with our help, of course.
Okay. Any chance to include this in the next oXygen release out of the box?
Well, you should answer that, George. I'm not sure if in the next oXygen version, because version 19 will be released in a month or so, and definitely I would like to polish the plugin a bit more, write more tests for it. So it's an interesting idea. It's not my decision. Maybe George can tell us more about it.
Maybe as a first step, we can make it available as one of the optional plugins for oXygen, so it's a lot easier to discover that, because it will be available in the list of plugins without adding any specific
yes, we can definitely do that.
Maybe you can make a note so you don't forget.
I will.
Can you describe what changes are in the new version of XSpec 0.5?
Well, I don't know them by heart, but if you go on the GitHub page, can you make me the presenter, George? Right, so if you go on the GitHub page of the XSpec project, you'll be able to see all the issues, and on the it has a releases.
Releases.
I cannot
30
see it.
log here, 2 releases. Yeah.
Yes, all right, I saw it. And here you see that version 0.5 solved a number of issues. So have a look. It's a good thing. I mean, people that work with XSLT, like Sandro Cirulis, um, have bumped in some issues, and they've took things into their own hands and started to improve the framework, and that's a great thing. So that's how we now have a new version.
Okay, more questions. Can you use XSpec on schematron or on schematron quickfixes? Well, XSpec was not designed to be used with schematron. Of course, schematron is finally compiled into an XSLT, let's say, but it's, I'm not sure exactly what XSpec will test on a schematron schema. Maybe if you can follow up with some ideas, maybe also the XSpec developers will be interested to hear what can be done.
That's interesting, yes.
Yeah, it's
Could
interesting to think
generate
about
that
that.
XSLT from the schematron and apply that somehow.
Okay, so follow up on this is that there is an open issue for XSpec to add schematron support.
Oh.
Okay. Is XSLT 3.0 supported by XSpec or only 2.0 or only 1.0?
Yes, it is, and this is actually one of the issues that was solved in in the latest release. So support for XSLT 3.0 was added.
Okay. Okay, so that's feature request 75 in the XSpec. You'll okay, and a follow up on testing when you have generated content. Processing cleaning the results before testing against the expected results sounds interesting. Can I see an example somewhere? Well, I do not have that at hand, but I imagine that you can pass, the result maybe through a name template, for instance, calling a template that will remove those parts, and then you assert that.
Right, right.
So, like
Having some
placing,
utility templates.
yes, yeah, but you will need those maybe in your XSLT style sheet. So then I don't know. I'll look into this and maybe follow up after the webinar or have a blog post about that if we arrive uh, to a decision. Otherwise, it may be a feature request for XSpec to specify, what's ignorable when you test, like the ID attributes or something like that. So when it checks a result against expected results, to ignore some parts. I think we managed to go through all the questions we received so far. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Alex, for presenting.
It was my pleasure, George.
And also for developing this interesting plugin that everyone wants to have that.
Also my pleasure. It was very exciting working on it.
And I want to take this opportunity to invite you also to join us for some of our following events. So if you go on our website under company events, you can find the next webinars. So basically next week we'll discuss multimedia support in oXygen. And then in 3 weeks we'll have our technical writer that creates the oXygen XML documentation, perspective on using data. Should be quite interesting, I guess. Then will be also a number of conferences, the Data North America conference, and then will be also the SDC Summit. And before that, we will have a meetup in Washington, which we just posted today on our website, which will be hosted by Mulberry Technologies. So if you are in the Washington DC area in May, both me and Alex will be there, so we'll be happy to meet you and you know,
Talk
discuss
about
more about
XSpec.
what we are doing,
Schematron.
quick fixes, XSLT, and also authoring and so on. So thank you again. Thank you, Alex, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you all for coming. Bye bye.
Bye.